I'm Sophia, 21, and I never imagined my own family would humiliate me at my father's funeral. Aunt Patricia practically spat. Poor Sophia, still pretending she's important. My Uncle Richard added fuel to the fire. Her father was nobody, a fifth-rate criminal who died without a dime. The entire family nodded in agreement, whispering about my pathetic bloodline. My cousin Jake sneered. At least we come from respectable people. Then three black SUVs pulled up. Men in expensive suits stepped out, kissed my hand, and said, "Miss Sophia, the dawn is waiting." Everyone fell silent. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt completely betrayed by family. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. Let me take you back to how this all started. My name is Sophia Martinez, and up until 3 days ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was. The unwanted daughter, the family disappointment, the girl who inherited the wrong blood, as they loved to remind me. My father, Carlos Martinez, died last Tuesday from a heart attack. Sudden, unexpected, devastating. For 21 years, he'd been my entire world, the only person who ever truly loved me. After my mother died when I was 8, he raised me alone. He was always mysterious about his work, but he never let me want for anything. He gave me the best education money could buy, hired 2 wonderful nannies who doubled as bodyguards, though I didn't understand why at the time, and made sure I learned 3 languages fluently while keeping me completely separate from whatever business paid for our comfortable life. Mija, he'd say when I asked questions, some knowledge is a burden. Let me carry it so you don't have to. The family I'd grown up around, my mother's relatives, made no secret of their disgust with our situation. They lived in the same neighborhood, close enough that I couldn't escape their constant judgments and cruel comments about my father's mysterious income and lack of social standing. Every family gathering became an opportunity for them to remind me that I didn't belong. They'd praise each other's legitimate careers while making pointed remarks about people who live in shadows and children who don't know where their money comes from. But nothing prepared me for the funeral. Standing in that receiving line, wearing the black dress my father had bought me for my college graduation, I watched his coffin being lowered into the ground while my mother's family treated his death like an inconvenience. Well, Aunt Patricia announced loudly enough for the entire cemetery to hear, at least now Sophia can stop living off dirty money and get a real job like the rest of us. Uncle Richard chuckled, assuming anyone will hire someone with her background. Criminal families tend to breed criminal children. My cousin Emma, who never worked a day in her privileged life, added, "It's actually kind of sad. She probably doesn't even know how to function in legitimate society." Each word felt like a physical blow, but I kept my composure. My father had taught me that showing weakness to enemies was the fastest way to lose everything. I just hadn't realized until that moment that my own family were my enemies. The cemetery was nearly empty when the 3 black SUVs arrived. I was standing alone by my father's grave, having sent away the few genuine mourners who had attended. The vehicles moved with purpose, parking in perfect formation near the entrance. 6 men stepped out, all in expensive suits that screamed money and authority. They walked toward me with the kind of controlled confidence that made everyone else instinctively step back. The leader, a distinguished man in his 50s with silver hair and kind eyes, approached me directly. Without hesitation, he took my hand and kissed it gently, a gesture of respect I'd never experienced from my own relatives. "Miss Sophia," he said in accented English, "I am Vincente Torino. Your father spoke of you constantly. The dawn is waiting to meet you." My mother's family, who'd been preparing to leave, froze like deer in headlights. Suddenly, the same people who'd spent 21 years calling my father a nobody were staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to pure terror. Everyone in our city knew exactly who Vincente Torino was. If he was calling someone Don, it meant my father hadn't been the small-time criminal they'd always claimed.
It meant he'd been something far more powerful than any of them had ever imagined. The ride to meet the Don felt like traveling to another world entirely. Vincente Torino sat across from me in the back of the lead SUV, his presence both comforting and intimidating. The interior was pristine leather and polished wood, more luxurious than anything I'd ever experienced. Your father was very careful to keep you separate from our world, but now that he's gone, there are things you need to understand about your inheritance. Inheritance, the word hung in the air like a question mark. My father always lived comfortably, but I never imagined there was significant money involved. Certainly nothing that would require men like Vincente Torino to personally deliver the news. I don't understand, I said carefully. My father sold insurance. Vincente's smile was knowing. Your father controlled 70% of the legitimate businesses in this city, and quite a few of the illegitimate ones as well. Insurance was just one of his many interests. My world tilted sideways. Everything I thought I knew about my life, about my father, and about why my mother's family hated us so much suddenly made sense in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. We pulled up to an estate that looked like something from a movie. Massive iron gates, manicured gardens, a house that could easily hold 50 people. This wasn't just wealth, this was power made visible. Before we go inside, Vincente said with his hand on my arm, I need you to understand something important. Your father left specific instructions about your education into this world. Nothing will be forced on you, but everything will be available to you. The man waiting for us in the study was not what I expected. Don Alessandro Torino, Vincente's older brother, was in his 60s with white hair and gentle eyes that missed nothing. He stood when I entered, another sign of respect my own family had never shown me. Sofia Martinez, he said, taking my hands in his. Your father was one of my closest friends for over 20 years. His loss is a loss for all of us. Thank you, I managed, still processing that my father had friends I'd never met, a life I'd never seen. Please sit. Don Alessandro gestured to a leather chair that probably cost more than most people's cars. We have much to discuss. He moved to an antique desk and returned with a thick folder. This contains the basic overview of your father's holdings, real estate, legitimate businesses, investment portfolios, and other interests. I opened the folder with trembling hands. The numbers didn't make sense at first. Too many zeros, too many properties, too many businesses with my father's name on the ownership documents. I don't understand, I whispered. This says he owned the entire downtown shopping complex and the Marina restaurant group. I kept reading, my voice trailing off. Your father was worth approximately $50 million, Don Alessandro said simply. All of it now belongs to you. The room spun slightly. 50 million. While my mother's family had spent 21 years calling us poor and calling my father a failure, I had been the daughter of a multi-millionaire. But there's more, Vincente added, pulling out another folder. Your father also held certain responsibilities in our organization. Those don't automatically transfer to you, but they're available if you choose to learn. What kind of responsibilities? I asked, though I beginning to understand exactly what kind of organization required men like the Torino brothers. Your father mediated disputes, provided certain types of protection for local businesses, and ensured that various operations ran smoothly. All technically legal, but requiring a specific skill set and connections. I thought about my father's late-night phone calls, the meetings in our home that stopped whenever I entered the room, and the way certain people treated him with a mixture of respect and fear that I'd never understood. He kept me away from all of this, I said. Because he loved you, Vincent replied. He wanted you to have a choice, to live a normal life if that's what you preferred. But he also prepared for the possibility that someday you might want to understand your heritage. What happens if I choose not to participate? I asked. You inherit everything financial with no obligations, Don Alessandro assured me. You could walk away right now, take the money, and live whatever life you choose. Your father made sure of that. But as I sat in that study looking at documents representing more wealth than I'd ever imagined, I found myself thinking about my mother's family, about 21 years of being called worthless, pathetic, and an embarrassment to their respectable bloodline, about how they treated my father's death like a relief, as if they were finally free of the criminal element that had contaminated their perfect family tree. "I want to learn," I said quietly. "I want to understand what my father built." Both men smiled, and I realized this was exactly what they'd hoped I would say. "Then your education begins tomorrow," Don Alessandro announced. "But tonight you rest. Vincent will take you home, and tomorrow we'll start showing you your father's world." As we drove back through the city, past buildings and businesses that I now knew belonged to me, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Power. Real power. Not just money, but the ability to shape outcomes, to command respect, to make choices that mattered. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice was already whispering about all the ways I might use that power to balance some very old scales. The next morning, Vincent arrived at my house with coffee and a different kind of education. Instead of the imposing SUV, he drove a modest sedan, teaching me the first lesson of my new world: never be predictable. "Your father understood that real power comes from being underestimated," he explained as we drove through the city. "Let people think you're just a pretty girl with inherited money. They'll make mistakes, and mistakes create opportunities." Our first stop was the Marina Restaurant Group headquarters, where I was introduced as the new owner to a staff who clearly already knew exactly who I was. The manager, a sharp woman named Isabella, walked me through operations with a kind of deference I'd never received in my entire life. "Your father visited every location monthly," she explained, showing me financial reports that made my head spin. "He knew every employee's name, every supplier's situation, every detail that mattered." I studied the numbers, remembering how my father had always been obsessed with details. Now I understood why. These weren't just restaurants. They were carefully orchestrated operations that provided cover for more complex activities. "The books are immaculate because your father insisted on legitimacy wherever possible: clean money, honest employees, quality service. The reputation protects everything else." Everything else. The phrase hung in the air, heavy with implications I was only beginning to grasp. After lunch, Vincent took me to meet Thomas Chen, my father's accountant and financial advisor. Thomas had managed the legitimate investments for 15 years, turning my father's initial capital into something approaching a small fortune through careful legal means. "Your father was adamant about one thing," Thomas explained as we reviewed portfolio statements. "Never let illegal activities contaminate the legitimate businesses. Keep them completely separate, completely clean." The wisdom of this strategy became clear as I looked at tax returns, audit reports, and financial statements that could withstand any government scrutiny. My father had built an empire that could survive investigation because half of it was entirely above board. "So, what's the other half?" I asked Vincent as we left Thomas's office. "That," he said with a slight smile, "is tomorrow's lesson." But first, he had one more stop planned. We drove to an upscale law firm where I met Patricia Williams, a senior partner who'd been handling my father's legal affairs for a decade. "Your father prepared extensively for this transition," Patricia explained, producing documents I'd never seen before: wills, trusts, power of attorney arrangements, business succession plans, all designed to ensure I inherited without complications. She handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in my father's distinctive handwriting. "He asked me to give this to you after your first day of education." I opened it with shaking hands, recognizing my father's voice immediately in the carefully chosen words. "Mija, if you're reading this, then you've begun to understand the life I kept hidden from you. I hope you can forgive me for the deception, but I needed you to have a choice. You can walk away from all of this with the legitimate businesses and investments worth enough to support you for life, or you can embrace the full heritage I've left you. The choice is yours, and I will love you regardless. But if you choose to continue my work, remember this: honor is everything. Family loyalty is sacred, and never let anyone make you feel small again. You are the daughter of Carlos Martinez, and that name means something in this world. Use it wisely. Kona Moore, Papa. Sitting in Patricia's office, reading my father's final words, something crystallized inside me. For 21 years, I'd allowed my mother's family to define me as the daughter of a nobody, a criminal, someone to be ashamed of. But my father hadn't been a nobody. He'd been someone who commanded respect, built something lasting, created a legacy worth inheriting. And I was his daughter, the sole heir to everything he'd worked to build. Patricia, I said, folding the letter carefully, I want you to prepare some documents for me. What kind of documents? I'm going to make some changes to my father's will and estate planning. There are some people who need to understand exactly who they've been dealing with all these years. Vincent's expression grew interested. What did you have in mind? I thought about my cousin Jake, who'd spent the funeral making jokes about my criminal bloodline, about Uncle Richard, who'd called my father a failure, about Aunt Patricia, who'd said I needed to get a real job now that the dirty money was gone. I want them to know, I said simply. I want them to understand exactly what they lost when they decided I wasn't worth their respect. Patricia smiled. I think your father would approve of that. What's your timeline? Give me a few months to learn everything I need to know, then we'll see about arranging some family reunions. Have you ever discovered that everything you thought you knew was wrong? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that like button if you're ready to see some family get their comeuppance. The drive home was quiet, both Vincent and I lost in our own thoughts. But as we pulled into my driveway, I realized something fundamentally changed. This morning I'd been Sophia Martinez, the ashamed daughter of questionable parentage. Tonight, I was Sophia Martinez, heiress to an empire with the resources to reshape my entire world. And I was just getting started. 3 weeks into my education, I learned that my father's other interests were far more sophisticated than I'd imagined. Vincent introduced me to a world where handshake agreements were worth millions, where respect was currency, and where my father's name opened doors I'd never known existed. Your father specialized in what we call business consulting, Don Alessandro explained during one of our weekly meetings.
Your father solved those problems. I was learning the language, the careful way of describing activities that existed in the gray areas between legal and illegal, protection services that prevented theft and vandalism, mediation services that resolved disputes before they escalated to violence, consulting services that ensured businesses operated without interference. It's about maintaining order, Vincent explained as we toured one of the warehouses. The police can't be everywhere. Courts are slow and expensive, but people still need help when problems arise. The warehouse was immaculate, filled with legitimate merchandise and run by employees who greeted me with genuine respect. But I was beginning to understand that not all the problems my father solved involved merchandise that appeared on official inventory sheets. How much of it was actually illegal? I asked Vincent directly. He considered the question carefully. Your father was brilliant at finding ways to accomplish objectives without breaking laws. When laws were broken, it was usually by other people who chose not to accept his reasonable solutions to their problems. It was a distinction that mattered in this world. My father hadn't been a thug or a common criminal. He'd been a businessman who operated in spaces where traditional business couldn't function, providing services people needed but couldn't get through official channels.
The complexity became clear when I met David Rodriguez, who ran one of my father's consulting operations. David walked me through case studies that read like MBA scenarios with higher stakes. A local restaurant owner was being extorted by gang members, David explained, showing me files that were meticulously detailed. Police couldn't prove anything. Victims were too scared to testify. Your father arranged for the gang to receive a better offer from a rival territory, solving the problem without violence. And if they hadn't accepted the better offer, I asked, then they would have faced consequences for their poor business decision, David replied, diplomatically. I was beginning to appreciate my father's genius. He'd built a system that provided real value to clients while minimizing legal exposure and avoiding the crude violence that characterized less sophisticated operations. But the lesson that changed everything came during my fourth week when Vincent took me to meet Marcus Thompson, the owner of Thompson Construction. Marcus was a hardworking man in his 50s who'd built a successful company from nothing. When we arrived at his office, he looked haggard and stressed, carrying a weight too heavy for his shoulders. "Miss Martinez," he said, standing when I entered his office, "I knew your father well. He was a good man who helped me more than once." "Tell her about your current situation," Vincent suggested. Marcus's story was unfortunately familiar. A larger construction company moved into the area and is using intimidation tactics to steal Thompson's contracts. They vandalized my equipment, threatened my workers, and have connections with city officials that make legal recourse impossible. "I've lost 3 major contracts in the past month," Marcus explained. "If this continues, I'll be bankrupt for Christmas. 27 employees will lose their jobs." "Have you gone to the police?" I asked. Marcus laughed bitterly. "The police chief's brother works for the company that's targeting me. They've made it clear any complaints I file will be ignored." This was exactly the kind of situation my father had specialized in resolving. A legitimate businessman being destroyed by corruption and intimidation, with no legal remedy available. "What would my father have done?" I asked Vincent. "Your father would have investigated the larger company's operations until he found vulnerabilities. Then he would have arranged for them to experience similar problems until they decided our territory was too expensive to operate in." "But is that what you're suggesting I do?" I asked. "I'm suggesting you have options," Vincent replied carefully. "Options your father spent 20 years developing." I studied Marcus Thompson's face, seeing the desperation and exhaustion of a man watching his life's work be destroyed by bullies. Then I thought about my own life, about 21 years of being bullied by my mother's family, about all the times I'd wished someone would stand up for me. "Set up a meeting with the people who are causing Mr. Thompson's problems," I said quietly. "It's time for me to learn how my father handled difficult negotiations." Vincent smiled. "Now you're beginning to understand your inheritance." The meeting was arranged for the following Tuesday at a neutral location, a private dining room at one of the restaurants I now owned. Vincent spent the weekend coaching me on negotiation tactics that weren't taught in business schools. "Never threaten directly," he instructed. "Offer alternatives. Make it clear cooperation serves everyone's interests, while resistance creates complications. And if they refuse to cooperate, then they learn why your father was respected throughout the city." Tuesday arrived with an early autumn chill that seemed appropriate for my first real test as Carlos Martinez's daughter. I dressed carefully in a conservative suit that projected authority without being ostentatious. My father had taught me understated power was always more effective than obvious displays. The representatives from Atlantic Construction arrived precisely on time, 3 men in expensive suits who clearly expected to intimidate a young woman into backing down. They hadn't done their homework about whose daughter they were meeting. "Gentlemen," I said, standing to greet them as Vincent made introductions, "I thank you for taking the time to meet with me. I understand there's been some confusion about territorial boundaries. Richard Atlantic, the company's vice president, smirked as he took his seat. Miss Martinez, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're a legitimate business operating within our legal rights. If some local contractors can't compete, that's market forces. I appreciate your perspective, I replied calmly, but I think you may not fully understand the local business environment. My father spent 20 years building relationships in this community. Those relationships come with certain obligations. Your father is dead, Atlantic replied bluntly. Whatever arrangements he had don't concern us. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Vincent's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted in a way that made all three men suddenly pay closer attention. Mr. Atlantic, I said, keeping my voice level, I think you've misunderstood the nature of this meeting. I'm not asking you to honor my father's arrangements. I'm informing you about the consequences of disrespecting them. What happened next would determine whether I truly was my father's daughter or just a rich girl playing with dangerous toys. Richard Atlantic's confidence wavered slightly, but he wasn't backing down yet. Are you threatening us, Miss Martinez? Because I should mention we have connections with city officials who might be very interested in your family's business practices. I had to admire his attempted power play. It revealed exactly how little he understood about the situation. Vincent had prepared me for this moment when someone tried to use official authority as leverage. Mr. Atlantic, I said, opening a folder Vincent had prepared over the past week. You mentioned city officials. Let me share some information about your connections that might interest you. I slid across photographs and documents Vincent's people had compiled over the past week. Images of Atlantic construction vehicles at job sites not listed on their official contracts, invoices for materials diverted to private projects, and timesheets showing city employees working on Atlantic's personal properties during official hours. It seems your company has been very creative with public contracts, I continued, as Atlantic's face paled.
Atlantic's two associates shifted nervously in their chairs. They had come expecting to intimidate a grieving daughter into submission. Instead, they were discovering that the daughter had inherited more than just money. Where did you get these? Atlantic demanded. My father taught me that information is the most valuable commodity in any business, I replied. He also taught me that successful people create mutually beneficial arrangements rather than trying to destroy each other. What do you want? One of his associates asked. I want Atlantic Construction to focus on the territories where you were operating before you decided to expand into our community, I said simply. Thompson Construction and the other local companies returned to operating without interference. Everyone continues making money in their respective areas. And if we refuse? Atlantic asked. I looked at Vincent, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Time to show whether I had truly learned my father's lessons. Then these documents get forwarded to the appropriate authorities, I said calmly. Your contracts get audited, your connections with city officials become liabilities rather than assets, and you discover why my father was able to operate successfully in this city for 20 years while others struggled. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Atlantic was clearly calculating whether his political connections could protect him from the evidence I had presented, while simultaneously realizing that I had access to information networks he hadn't known existed. We'll consider your proposal, he said finally. You have until Friday to withdraw from the Thompson contract and the two other disputed projects. After that, I'll assume you've chosen the more complicated path. After they left, Vincent and I sat in the private dining room reviewing what had just happened. My first real negotiation as my father's successor, and I had managed to not embarrass myself or get anyone killed. How did I do? I asked.
Your father would be proud. You offered them a reasonable solution, made the consequences of refusal clear, and gave them time to make the right decision. What if they don't withdraw by Friday? Then they learn that Carlos Martinez's daughter is not someone to ignore, Vincent said with a slight smile. Thursday evening, Marcus Thompson called to tell me that Atlantic Construction had announced they were refocusing their operations and withdrawing from all local contracts. The harassment of his workers had stopped, and his equipment was no longer being vandalized. I don't know what you said to them, but whatever it was, it worked. Thank you, Miss Martinez. Your father would be proud. Friday morning brought a more interesting development. Richard Atlantic called Vincent directly, requesting a meeting to discuss ongoing business relationships. It seemed they had done some research after our Tuesday meeting and discovered exactly who they had been dealing with. They want to apologize, Vincent explained, and they want to explore opportunities for cooperation rather than competition. This was the difference between my father's approach and crude gangster tactics. Instead of creating enemies, he converted opponents into allies. Atlantic Construction would now become another business relationship, another source of information and influence. But the real test came that weekend, when my education moved beyond business negotiations into more complex territory. Vincent picked me up Saturday morning with a different energy than usual, more serious, more focused. Today's lesson would be about the aspects of my father's business that required absolute discretion. Your father occasionally dealt with problems that couldn't be solved through negotiation or legal pressure, problems that required more direct solutions, Vincent explained as we drove toward the warehouse district. Problems that required more direct solutions. We arrived at a location I had never seen before, a nondescript building that could have been any industrial facility, but the security measures and the way Vincent was greeted by the staff made it clear this wasn't a normal warehouse. This is where your father handled situations that required specialized approaches, Vincent explained, leading me through a series of security doors. Everything here is designed to solve problems permanently while maintaining complete deniability. The interior was surprisingly sophisticated, clean, organized, professional. Whatever happened in this building, it was managed with the same attention to detail my father brought to everything else. I need you to understand something important. Vincent stopped in what appeared to be an office area. Your father never enjoyed this aspect of the business, but sometimes when people refused reasonable solutions and threatened innocent people, more permanent measures became necessary. I was beginning to understand why my father had kept me away from this world for 21 years. The weight of making decisions that could end lives, even the lives of people who arguably deserved it, was something he had wanted to spare me from for as long as possible. How often did he have to handle problems this way? I asked. Less than you might think, Vincent replied. Your father's reputation was usually enough to convince people to accept reasonable solutions. But when someone was determined to cause harm despite all warnings, he wouldn't let innocent people suffer. He showed me files documenting the rare cases when negotiation had failed, drug dealers who had targeted schools despite warnings, corrupt officials who had enabled abuse despite offers of alternative arrangements, and business owners who had chosen to destroy competitors rather than compete fairly. In each case, I could see my father's careful analysis, his attempts to find solutions that didn't require violence, his reluctant conclusion that some people simply wouldn't accept any resolution that didn't involve them harming others. This is your inheritance too, Vincent said quietly, the responsibility to protect people who can't protect themselves, even when it requires making difficult decisions. As we drove home, I realized my education was nearly complete. I understood the businesses, the relationships, the obligations, and the ultimate responsibilities that came with being Carlos Martinez's daughter. But more importantly, I was beginning to understand why my mother's family had always feared and resented my father. They had sensed the power, even though they had never understood its source or scope. Soon, they would understand both. 2 months after my father's funeral, I was finally ready to begin reshaping my relationship with my mother's family. The education Vincent and Don Alejandro had provided was comprehensive, but more importantly, I had proven to myself that I could handle the responsibilities that came with my inheritance. The Atlantic construction situation had established my credibility within my father's organization. Word spread quickly through the appropriate channels that Carlos Martinez's daughter was not a powerless heiress playing with inherited toys. I was someone who understood the business and could execute effective strategies. But before dealing with my family, I needed to complete one more piece of my education. Vincent arranged for me to meet Elena Vasquez, a woman who had worked with my father for over 15 years, managing what he called community relations. Elena was in her 40s, elegant and sharp-eyed, with the kind of quiet authority that made people pay attention without her having to raise her voice. She had been one of my father's most trusted advisors, particularly when it came to managing public perception and political relationships. Your father understood that real power requires legitimacy. People need to believe you deserve your position, that you've earned your influence through merit rather than inheritance alone. This was the sophisticated aspect of my father's operation that separated it from common criminal enterprises. He had built genuine community support by solving real problems for ordinary people, creating a reservoir of goodwill that protected him from official interference.
How do I establish that legitimacy? I asked. By continuing your father's work, Elena replied. The community needs to see that Carlos Martinez's daughter shares his values and his commitment to helping people who have nowhere else to turn. She showed me files documenting the community programs my father had quietly supported: scholarship funds for students from struggling families, small business loans for entrepreneurs who couldn't qualify for traditional financing, and legal assistance for people who couldn't afford proper representation. Your father never publicized any of this, Elena explained. But word spreads in communities when someone consistently helps without asking for recognition. That's how you build the kind of loyalty that lasts generations. I studied the documents, seeing another side of my father's character that explained why so many people had attended his funeral, despite the mysterious nature of his business. He genuinely cared about improving people's lives, not just accumulating power and wealth. I want to continue all of these programs, I decided, and I want to expand them. Elena smiled. That's exactly what your father hoped you'd say. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into learning the community side of my inheritance. I met with scholarship recipients, visited small businesses my father had helped establish, and attended community meetings where I listened more than I spoke. The experience was revelatory. For 21 years, my mother's family had insisted that my father was a nobody, a criminal who contributed nothing to society. But everywhere I went, I met people whose lives had been improved by his quiet generosity. Marcus Thompson introduced me to other business owners who'd received help when banks turned them away. A high school guidance counselor showed me thank you letters from students whose college dreams had been made possible by my father's scholarship fund. A legal aid attorney explained how my father's contributions had allowed them to represent victims of domestic violence who couldn't pay for proper advocacy. Your father never wanted credit. He just wanted problems solved and people helped. That's what made him special.
By November, 3 months after my father's death, I felt ready to begin the next phase of my plan. It was time for my mother's family to discover exactly who they'd been disrespecting for 21 years. The opportunity presented itself when my cousin, Jake, called me for the first time since the funeral. His voice had an artificial friendliness that immediately put me on alert. "Sophia, I've been thinking about you. I know things were tense at the funeral, but we're still family. Maybe we could get together sometime." Interesting. Jake had never shown the slightest interest in spending time with me before my father's death. Now, suddenly, he wanted to maintain family connections. "What did you have in mind?" I asked, neutrally. "Well, actually, I was hoping you might be able to help me with something. I'm starting a new business venture and could use some investment capital since you probably inherited some money from your father." There it was. Jake had somehow learned that I'd inherited something significant and now wanted access to it. The same cousin who'd spent the funeral making jokes about my pathetic bloodline was now looking for financial assistance from that same bloodline. "What kind of business venture?" I asked, genuinely curious about his level of desperation. "Import-export consulting," he replied vaguely. "There's a lot of opportunity in international trade if you have the right connections." Import-export consulting. The euphemism almost made me laugh. Jake was either trying to get into some form of smuggling operation or using impressive-sounding language to disguise a much less sophisticated scheme. "How much investment are you looking for?" I asked. "Well, to really do it right, I'd need about $50,000 to get started, but even 20 or 30 would help establish the initial operations." $50,000 to Jake probably seemed like an enormous amount of money. He had no idea I could write a check for that without even noticing the impact on my account balance. "Interesting," I said. "Let me think about it. Why don't you put together a business plan and we can meet to discuss it properly?" The eagerness in his voice was almost pathetic. "Really? That would be amazing, Sophia. I always knew you were the smart one in the family." Amazing how my intelligence had suddenly become apparent to him, almost as if it correlated directly with his potential usefulness to his financial situation. "I'll call you in a few days," I promised, already formulating exactly how I wanted to handle the situation. After hanging up, I immediately called Vincent to discuss my cousin's request. This was the perfect opportunity to begin demonstrating my father's legacy to my mother's family, but I wanted to make sure I handled it correctly. "Jake Martinez is asking for investment capital," I explained. "I think this might be the beginning of a pattern." "How do you want to proceed?" Vincent asked. "I want to know everything about Jake's financial situation and this business venture he's planning. And I want to start planning a family gathering where certain information about my father's actual career gets shared." Vincent's approval was evident in his voice. "Your father would definitely approve of that approach. When were you thinking of having this gathering?" I considered the timing. Christmas was approaching, which meant the inevitable family dinner where I'd traditionally been ignored and insulted while everyone else celebrated their superiority. Christmas dinner. Time for some new family traditions. The wheels were finally in motion. Soon my mother's family would learn exactly what kind of legacy they'd spent 21 years disrespecting, and I was going to enjoy every moment of their education. Jake's business plan arrived by email 3 days later, and it was even more pathetic than I had expected. 6 pages of buzzword-filled nonsense about leveraging international market inefficiencies and providing consultative solutions for cross-border commerce optimization. Translation: he wanted to buy cheap goods from overseas and mark them up dramatically while calling himself an international business consultant. The financial projections were laughably optimistic. assuming he'd somehow capture significant market share despite having no experience, no connections, and no actual plan. But the most revealing part was his timeline. Jake needed the money within 2 weeks because he'd already committed to lease agreements and initial inventory purchases. He'd gambled his own finances on the assumption that I'd provide funding, which told me everything I needed to know about his opinion of my intelligence. He thinks you're a grief-stricken young woman who can be easily manipulated. Classic mistake of underestimating someone based on age and gender. What did your research turn up about his financial situation? I asked. Vincent handed me a folder that painted a clear picture of Jake's desperation. Credit cards maxed out, behind on rent, recently fired from his sales job for poor performance. His business venture wasn't an opportunity. It was a last-ditch attempt to avoid bankruptcy. He's been telling people he has family money coming through. Apparently, he's been bragging about his rich cousin who inherited her father's estate. Rich cousin. Interesting how quickly the narrative had changed from pathetic bloodline to rich family member once money became relevant. I want to meet with him, I decided. But not just to discuss his business plan. I want to start laying the groundwork for the Christmas dinner revelation. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at my house. I wanted Jake to see exactly how his poor cousin was living these days, to begin planting questions in his mind about where my apparent wealth was coming from.
Jake arrived precisely on time, which told me exactly how desperately he needed this meeting to go well. He was dressed in his best suit and brought printed copies of his business plan, clearly hoping to project confidence and professionalism. "Sophia, this house is incredible," he said, looking around my living room with barely concealed envy. "Your father must have left you pretty well set up." "He took care of me," I replied neutrally, offering him coffee from the expensive machine my father had installed years earlier. "I had no idea he was doing so well," Jake continued, fishing for information. "I mean, we always knew he was in business, but this level of success is really impressive. We always knew." Revisionist history at its finest. 3 months ago, Jake had been calling my father a fifth-rate criminal. Now he was acknowledging his business success. "My father was very good at what he did," I said simply. "What exactly was his business?" Jake asked. "I know it was something in consulting, but the specifics were always a bit unclear." This was the opening I'd been waiting for, the chance to begin Jake's education about what he'd been disrespecting all these years. My father provided specialized business solutions for clients who couldn't get help through traditional channels: problem solving, conflict resolution, business protection services. Jake nodded, as if this made perfect sense, though I could see him trying to figure out what kind of consulting paid for a house like mine. "That's actually similar to what I'm planning to do," he said, apparently missing the irony entirely. "Finding opportunities where other people don't see them." "It requires specific skills and connections," I replied. "My father spent 20 years building his reputation and client base." "Well, that's why I wanted to talk to you about possible investment." Jake pulled out his business plan copies. "With your father's background, you'd understand the potential in this kind of operation." I accepted his documents with appropriate seriousness, pretending to review financial projections that wouldn't survive contact with actual market conditions. "This is ambitious," I said diplomatically. "50,000 is a significant investment for a startup operation." "I know it seems like a lot," Jake replied quickly, "but the return potential is enormous. And honestly, for someone in your position, 50,000 isn't really that much money." Someone in my position. Jake had clearly convinced himself that I had inherited enough money to make his problems irrelevant. He had no idea how accurate that assessment actually was, just not for the reasons he assumed. "What makes you think I'm in a position to invest $50,000? I asked curiously. Jake looked confused by the question. "Well, I mean, this house, your father's business success, it's obvious you inherited significant assets." My father taught me to be careful about assumptions. Things aren't always what they appear to be. Of course," Jake agreed quickly. "I just thought
I mean, family helping family, right? And this would be a real investment opportunity, not just a handout. Family helping family. The same Jake who'd spent 21 years treating me like an embarrassment to the family name was now invoking family loyalty to justify asking for money. Tell me about this import-export consulting concept, I said, leaning back in my chair. What specific services would you be providing? For the next hour, Jake explained his business model with the kind of desperate enthusiasm that confirmed Vincent's assessment. He'd watched too many movies about international business and convinced himself he could replicate success without understanding any of the underlying complexity. But what made the conversation truly interesting was watching him recalibrate his approach as he absorbed details about my living situation, the expensive furniture, the high-end electronics, the casual mentions of property management and investment portfolios. By the end of our meeting, Jake was treating me with a level of respect I'd never received from any family member. Not because he'd suddenly recognized my worth as a person, but because he'd finally recognized my worth as a potential source of funding. I really appreciate you taking the time to consider this, he said as he prepared to leave. I know your father would want to see family members helping each other succeed. My father would want family members helping each other. Jake had never cared what my father wanted when he was alive, but now he was invoking his memory to justify his request for money. I'll review everything carefully, I promised. Why don't we continue this discussion at Christmas dinner? I'm sure the whole family would be interested in hearing about your business plans. Christmas dinner sounds perfect, Jake agreed eagerly. I'll bring updated projections. After he left, I called Vincent to report on the meeting's progress. He's definitely desperate, and he's starting to wonder exactly how much money I inherited, but he still has no idea what my father's actual business involved. Perfect setup for the Christmas revelation. How do you want to structure that conversation? I want the whole family there when they learn the truth. All of them together so they can see each other's reactions when they realize what they've been saying about my father for 21 years. What do you think will happen when Sophia's family discovers the truth about her father's empire? Drop your predictions in the comments below and make sure you're subscribed for what's coming next. The countdown to Christmas dinner was begun, and I was going to make sure it was a holiday celebration my mother's family would never forget. Planning Christmas dinner required more strategy than my family could possibly imagine. This wasn't just about revealing my father's true legacy. It was about orchestrating the perfect moment when 21 years of family dynamics would shift permanently in my favor. Vincent helped me understand the psychological elements that would make the revelation most effective. Your family has built their identity around being superior to you and your father. When that foundation gets destroyed, they'll go through predictable stages: denial, anger, bargaining, and finally acceptance of their new position in the family hierarchy. I wanted them all present for maximum impact. The core group included Aunt Patricia and Uncle Richard, my cousins Jake and Emma, and my grandmother Maria, who'd been the quiet enabler of everyone else's cruelty over the years. The invitation itself was carefully crafted. I called each family member personally, explaining that I wanted to host Christmas dinner at my house as a way of honoring my father's memory and bringing the family together during this difficult time. Of course, dear, Aunt Patricia had said with condescending sweetness, it's wonderful that you're ready to rejoin the family. Your father's death must have been such a wake-up call about what really matters. A wake-up call, indeed, just not in the way she imagined. Jake was particularly enthusiastic about the dinner invitation, clearly viewing it as an opportunity to discuss his business proposal in front of family members who might apply additional pressure for me to invest. I'm bringing those updated financial projections, he reminded me during our confirmation call. I think once everyone sees the potential returns, they'll understand why this is such a smart opportunity. I'm sure they'll find your presentation very educational. I agreed, meaning something entirely different from what he understood. Emma was the wild card. My cousin had always been the cruelest in her assessment of my father's character, but she was also the most socially ambitious. If she suspected I had significant money, she'd be calculating how to position herself advantageously. Sophia, I'm so glad you're finally ready to host family events. It shows real maturity and growth. I know your father would be proud. My father would be proud, coming from someone who'd spent years calling him a criminal and a failure.
But Emma's sudden acknowledgement of my maturity suggested she'd been hearing intriguing reports about my apparent wealth from her brother, Jake. The dinner menu was carefully selected to make a statement without appearing ostentatious. I hired a professional catering service renowned for managing high-end events, ensuring the quality would be unmistakably expensive yet tastefully subtle. Vincent arranged for additional security, discreetly disguised as catering staff and valet attendants. My family wouldn't realize they were dining under the watchful eyes of professionals authorized to act if necessary. Probably unnecessary, Vincent admitted, but your father always believed in being prepared for the unexpected. 2 days before Christmas, Elena Vasquez called with an update on community activities that would complement my dinner presentation. The scholarship announcements are scheduled for the day after Christmas, she reported. 15 students will receive full college funding, all in your father's name. The local newspaper wants to run a feature story on his community contributions. Perfect timing. My family was about to discover that the man they had labeled a worthless criminal had quietly funded more charitable efforts than they had contributed to in their entire lives combined. Christmas Eve arrived with snow and nervous anticipation. I spent the day reviewing my presentation materials and mentally rehearsing the conversation that would change everything. Vincent had prepared a folder of documents that would make my father's true status undeniable. But I wanted Jake's business proposal to serve as a natural lead-in to the larger revelations. On Christmas morning, I woke up in the house my father had purchased, surrounded by evidence of his success despite never being recognized by my mother's family. That was about to change permanently. The catering staff arrived at noon to begin preparations, professional, efficient, and clearly accustomed to events where appearance and discretion mattered equally. Watching them work reminded me of how my father had taught me to notice details that revealed character and competence. At 4 o'clock, the first guests arrived, Uncle Richard and Aunt Patricia, dressed in their finest clothes and carrying gifts that probably cost less than what I had spent on wine for the evening. "Oh, Sophia, darling," Aunt Patricia gushed, embracing me with artificial warmth. "This house is absolutely stunning. Your father certainly knew how to provide for you." "He took care of me in many ways," I replied, accepting her backhanded compliment with practiced grace. Uncle Richard studied the dining setup with obvious interest. Crystal glasses, fine china, silverware likely worth more than most people's monthly salary. His expression suggested he was revising his estimate of my inheritance upward. Jake and Emma arrived together, clearly having discussed what to expect from dinner at their suddenly wealthy cousin's house. Jake carried a leather portfolio that undoubtedly contained his revised business projections. "This is incredible," Emma said, admiring the living room. "I had no idea your father left you so well established." "There's a lot about my father you didn't know," I replied, meaningfully. Grandmother Maria arrived last, moving slowly but observing everything with sharp eyes that missed nothing. At 85, she had seen enough family drama to recognize when something significant was unfolding. "You've done well for yourself, Sophia," she said simply, accepting my help with her coat. "I'm continuing my father's legacy," I told her, letting the words carry implications she couldn't yet understand. Dinner conversation began politely, revolving around safe topics like weather and holiday plans. Yet beneath the surface, I sensed curiosity about my apparent wealth and Jake's eagerness to present his business proposal. "Sophia,"
Jake said as dessert was being served. "I was hoping we could discuss that investment opportunity I mentioned. I brought some updated materials that show even better potential returns." "Of course," I agreed. "But first, I'd like to share some information about my father's business activities that I think will interest everyone." The table fell silent as everyone turned their attention toward me, clearly assuming I was about to reveal details of my inheritance. "As you know, my father was involved in business consulting," I began, opening the folder Vincent had prepared. "What you may not have realized is how successful and influential his operations became." I pulled out the first document, a newspaper clipping about the scholarship fund announcement. "This article will be published tomorrow. It discusses 15 college scholarships being awarded in my father's name, funded by a foundation he established over a decade ago." Confused silence followed as each family member read about my father's educational philanthropy, charity work they had never known existed. "I don't understand," Aunt Patricia said slowly. "My father funded college scholarships, among other community initiatives," I confirmed, producing additional documents. "Business development loans for struggling entrepreneurs, legal aid for families who couldn't afford proper representation, and medical bill assistance for those facing bankruptcy due to healthcare costs." The expressions around the table shifted from confusion to shock as they absorbed the evidence of my father's extensive charitable activities. "But how," Uncle Richard began, then stopped as realization dawned. "How did a fifth-rate criminal afford to fund all these programs?" I finished his thought. "How did a so-called nobody build the kind of wealth required to establish permanent charitable foundations?" The moment of truth had arrived. I was ready to show my family exactly who they had disrespected for 21 years. The silence at the table was heavy as they processed the evidence of my father's philanthropy, struggling to reconcile their long-held beliefs about his character with undeniable proof of his integrity and success. "I think I need to continue calmly," I continued calmly. "It's time you understood what my father's business actually involved." I reached for the next set of documents in Vincent's meticulously organized folder. Business licenses, partnership agreements, property deeds, all bearing my father's name and representing legitimate enterprises worth millions. "Marina Restaurant Group," I said, sliding the papers across the table. 17 restaurants across the city, employing over 300 people. My father was the sole owner. Jake picked up the papers with trembling hands, examining the financial statements showing annual revenues exceeding $15 million. "This can't be right," he whispered. "These numbers are accurate," I confirmed. "The restaurant group was just one of his holdings. There's also Martinez Properties. 47 commercial and residential buildings throughout the metropolitan area." Emma's face went pale. "You're saying Uncle Carlos was a millionaire?" "Multi-millionaire," I corrected gently. "With extensive business interests, political connections, and the reputation for solving problems that others couldn't." I let that final phrase hang in the air, laden with implications they were only beginning to grasp. "What kind of problems?" Grandmother Maria asked quietly, her sharp eyes fixed on me. "The kind that required special expertise," I replied carefully. "My father provided consulting services for situations where traditional business methods didn't work." Uncle Richard examined the property documents, his hands shaking slightly as he recognized familiar city addresses, buildings he'd passed countless times, never realizing they belonged to the brother-in-law he'd spent decades mocking. "Vincent Torino sends his regards, by the way," I added casually, showing them a recent text message on my phone.
He's been helping me learn about my father's business relationships. The name Vincent Torino had the exact impact I expected. Everyone at the table recognized it, and suddenly the full scope of their ignorance became clear. Vincent Torino, Aunt Patricia repeated in a voice barely above a whisper. As in the respected businessman who's been helping me understand my inheritance, I confirmed, along with his brother, Don Alejandro, who spoke beautifully at a private memorial service you weren't invited to. The final piece clicked into place. For 21 years, they had assumed my father was a small-time criminal because they were too arrogant and narrow-minded to investigate what his business truly involved. In reality, he had been a significant figure in the city's most powerful organization, a man who commanded respect from politicians, business leaders, and people they never imagined knowing personally. "Sophia," Jake said, his voice strained, "are you saying your father was—" "I'm saying my father was Carlos Martinez, a name that carries weight in the city, something you never cared to learn about because you were too busy feeling superior to take him seriously." Emma began crying quietly, finally understanding the magnitude of her family's ignorance and the consequences of 21 years of condescension. "Why didn't he ever tell us?" Uncle Richard asked. "Why would he?" I countered. "You made it clear from the beginning that you had no respect for him or his work. He kept his business separate from family because family had already rejected him." I stood and moved to the window overlooking the garden my father had designed, giving them time to process the complete reversal of everything they believed about our family dynamic. "Jake," I said, turning back toward the table, "I understand you have a business proposition requiring $50,000 in investment capital." Jake looked up miserably, realizing his entrepreneurial dreams were about to be crushed under the weight of 2 decades of family history. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "I've reviewed your business plan and I'm afraid I can't support it. Not because I lack the funds. $50,000 is pocket change compared to what I inherited, but because I don't invest in businesses run by people who've spent years disrespecting my father's memory." The words landed like physical blows. Jake's face crumpled as he realized his financial salvation had evaporated due to his own past behavior. "However," I continued, "I'm not entirely sympathetic to family members facing financial difficulties." A spark of hope flickered in several pairs of eyes around the table. "So I've decided to offer assistance, but with conditions that reflect the new reality of our family situation." I returned to my seat, relishing the complete attention of people who had spent decades ignoring my existence. "Jake, your business plan is terrible, but your desperation is real. I'm prepared to offer you a job with one of my companies. Entry level, of course, since you have no relevant experience. The salary will be enough to resolve your immediate financial crisis." "A job?" he repeated blankly. "Working for me," I clarified. "Taking direction from me, following policies I establish, just like hundreds of other employees in the businesses I now control." The power dynamic had shifted completely. Jake would never again be in a position to condescend to me about anything, not when his livelihood depended on my goodwill. "Emma," I continued, "I understand you're between jobs after your recent termination from the marketing firm." Emma flinched at my casual mention of information she had tried to keep secret from the family. "I have openings in my restaurant management training program, competitive salary, excellent benefits, and real opportunity for advancement based on merit rather than family connections." "You'd hire me?" Emma asked uncertainly. "I'd give you a chance to prove yourself," I corrected, "something my father never received from this family." I looked around the table at faces still processing the complete transformation of our family hierarchy. "Uncle Richard, Aunt Patricia, I understand you've been facing some financial pressures with your mortgage." Their expressions shifted from hopeful to mortified as they realized I knew about their private financial struggles.
I'm prepared to resolve those difficulties, I said, in exchange for something my father deserved but never received from you. What? Uncle Richard asked wearily. Respect, I said simply. Public acknowledgement of what he accomplished and who he really was. An apology for 21 years of treating his daughter like an embarrassment to the family name. The silence that followed was deafening. They finally understood that their financial problems could be solved with a single phone call from me, but the price would be admitting they had been wrong about everything for their entire adult lives. And if we refuse? Aunt Patricia asked, quietly. I smiled with the same controlled expression my father had taught me for handling difficult negotiations. Then you'll discover exactly how well connected Carlos Martinez's daughter has become in the city, and how many people are eager to repay favors they owed my father by helping his daughter succeed. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. I wasn't just offering help. I was outlining the consequences of continued disrespect. I need to think about this, Uncle Richard said finally. Of course, I agreed graciously. Take all the time you need. But remember, my father spent 20 years building relationships and reputation in this community. I inherited all of that, along with the businesses and the money. As my family left that evening, each carrying documentation of my father's true legacy, I realized I'd accomplished exactly what I'd planned. They would never again be able to pretend superiority over Carlos Martinez or his daughter. The power dynamic had shifted permanently in my favor. But the best part was still to come. New Year's Eve arrived with unexpected developments. My family had spent the week since Christmas dinner doing exactly what I anticipated, researching everything they could find about my father's empire and discovering how profoundly they had misjudged our family's place in the city's power structure. Jake called first, his voice carrying a humility I'd never heard before. Sophia, I've been thinking about your job offer. I want you to know how grateful I am for the opportunity and how sorry I am for everything. Everything, I prompted, wanting him to be specific. For treating you badly all these years, for disrespecting Uncle Carlos, for not understanding what we were dealing with. He paused as he struggled with his new reality. I know I don't deserve your help after how I behaved. You're right, I agreed simply. You don't deserve it. But my father taught me that mercy is more powerful than revenge when it's applied strategically. Thank you, Jake said quietly. When can I start? Monday morning, 8 o'clock, at the Marina Restaurant Group headquarters. Vincent will explain your duties and expectations. The fact that Jake would be reporting directly to Vincent, not a minor manager, would ensure he understood exactly where he stood in the hierarchy. Emma's call came 2 hours later, carrying similar humility, but with more calculation in her tone. Sophia, I want to accept your training program offer. But I also want you to know that I've spent this week learning about Uncle Carlos's community contributions. I had no idea he was helping so many people. I want to be part of continuing that legacy, if you'll let me. I want to do better than I have been. Emma was being more strategic than Jake, trying to position herself as someone genuinely moved by our father's philanthropy rather than merely seeking financial rescue. A smart approach, though it remained to be seen whether her sincerity was real or simply opportunist.
We'll see how you do in the restaurant program first, I told her. If you prove yourself capable and committed, there may be opportunities to participate in community initiatives. Uncle Richard and Aunt Patricia's response was more complicated. They appeared at my door on New Year's Day, both looking as though they'd aged years in the past week. Sophia, Aunt Patricia began, her voice lacking its usual condescending tone. We owe you an apology, a serious apology for many years of terrible behavior. We were wrong about your father, Uncle Richard added quietly, completely wrong. And we were wrong about how we treated you. I invited them in, curious to see how they would handle this conversation. Pride was clearly warring with financial necessity, creating a visible internal conflict on their faces. I've been researching your father's business activities, Uncle Richard continued, as we sat in my living room. The legitimate holdings, the community programs, the charitable foundations. I had no idea of the scope of what he'd built, or the respect he commanded. Aunt Patricia added, "We spoke to people who knew him, people in business and government. They all said the same thing. Carlos Martinez was someone you wanted as an ally, not an enemy. And yet, we treated him as an enemy for 21 years. I observed. Yes, Uncle Richard acknowledged painfully. We did, because we were arrogant, ignorant, and too proud to admit we didn't understand what we were seeing. Aunt Patricia was crying quietly. Sophia, I know we don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm asking anyway, for a chance to be better family members, to honor your father's memory properly. This was what I'd been waiting for, not just an admission of error, but genuine recognition of the harm they'd caused and a commitment to different behavior moving forward. I said, "What are you specifically asking for?" "Help with our financial situation," Uncle Richard replied directly. "But more than that, we're asking for a chance to be family to you, the way we should have been all along." "And what would that look like?" I asked. "Sunday dinners," Aunt Patricia suggested. "Real conversations about your life and your father's memory, including you in family decisions instead of excluding you, treating you like the successful, accomplished woman you are instead of like a burden we had to tolerate. Those things shouldn't require my financial leverage to motivate them," I pointed out. "You're right," Uncle Richard agreed. "They should have happened because we loved you. The fact that it took learning about your inheritance to change our behavior is shameful." Their honesty was more than I'd expected. They weren't just apologizing for strategic reasons, they seemed genuinely to understand how badly they'd failed as family members. I'll decided, I'll resolve your mortgage situation, and I'll include you in family activities going forward, but with clear conditions. "What conditions?" Aunt Patricia asked. "First, you'll participate in the public recognition ceremony for my father's charitable foundation, full attendance and public acknowledgement of his contributions to the community." They both nodded in agreement. "Second, you'll treat the people who work for me with respect. Jake and Emma are my employees now, which means their success or failure reflects on me. I expect full family support for their professional development." "Of course," Uncle Richard said. "Third, you'll accept that family gatherings now happen at my house, under my rules, celebrating my father's memory appropriately." "We understand," Aunt Patricia agreed. The negotiations continued for another hour, establishing the new framework for our family relationships. By the time they left, the power dynamic had been formally restructured, with my position as family matriarch clearly established. But the most satisfying call came that evening from Grandmother Maria. "Sophia," she said in her still strong voice, "I want you to know that I'm proud of how you've handled this situation." "Thank you, Grandmother. Your father raised you well. He taught you to be strong without being cruel, powerful without being petty. He would be proud of the woman you've become." "I hope so. I also want you to know that I've rewritten my will," she added matter-of-factly. "Everything comes to you now. The house, the savings, the jewelry. Your cousins had their chances to be good family members and they failed. You're the only one who deserves to carry on the family legacy." This was unexpected. Grandmother Maria's estate wasn't enormous, but it represented the final symbolic transfer of family authority, from the generation that had rejected my father to the generation that would honor his memory. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Absolutely certain," she replied firmly. "You're the future of this family, Sophia. Act accordingly." As I hung up the phone, I realized that in less than 6 months, I'd gone from being the family outcast to the person everyone else depended on for their financial and social stability. My father's legacy hadn't just been the businesses and money he left me, it had been the lessons about power, respect, and the long-term thinking required to reshape
entire situations to your advantage. The family that humiliated me at his funeral now answered to me. The cousins who'd mocked my bloodline now worked for me. The relatives who called my father a criminal now acknowledged him as a respected community leader. But there was still one more lesson from my father that I needed to apply. He taught me that true power meant helping people who couldn't help themselves, not just controlling those who'd wronged you. The community work, the scholarship funds, the business development programs, those would be my real legacy. The proof that Carlos Martinez's daughter understood the responsibility that came with inherited power. But for now, I was content to savor the complete transformation of my family dynamics. Justice, it turned out, really was a dish best served cold. 6 months later, the annual Community Leadership Award ceremony provided the perfect stage for my family's public recognition of my father's legacy. The event was held at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, attended by the city's most influential business leaders, politicians, and community organizers. I sat at the head table, wearing the elegant black dress and diamond necklace my father had given me for my college graduation. To my right sat Don Alessandro Torino, whose presence sent clear signals about my position in the city's power structure. To my left sat Mayor Patricia Williams, who had specifically requested to meet Carlos Martinez's remarkable daughter. "Your father was instrumental in developing the waterfront district," the mayor explained during cocktails. "His investment in infrastructure and business development created over 2,000 jobs. The city owes him a debt of gratitude." From across the room, I could see my family clustered near the Martinez Community Foundation display, all wearing their best clothes and expressions of newfound pride in my father's accomplishments. Jake looked the part of a successful restaurant manager, which he had become during his 6 months working for Vincent. The experience had been educational for him in ways beyond business operations. He now understood exactly what kind of organization had employed his uncle and what kind of respect that organization commanded throughout the city. "Miss Martinez," he'd said during our monthly check-in meeting, "I want you to know how much I've learned about Uncle Carlos this year. Vincent and the other managers have told me stories about his generosity and leadership that I never knew." Emma had embraced her role in the restaurant training program with surprising enthusiasm, discovering she had genuine talent for hospitality management. More importantly, she'd volunteered to help coordinate the foundation's scholarship selection process, showing real commitment to continuing my father's charitable work. It was about results, helping people without making them feel obligated or embarrassed. Uncle Richard and Aunt Patricia had transformed into model family members, hosting Sunday dinners where they proudly discussed my father's business acumen and community contributions. Their mortgage troubles were a distant memory, replaced by genuine gratitude and a determination to make up for decades of poor behavior. "Ladies and gentlemen," the ceremony announcer called, "please welcome tonight's keynote speaker, Sophia Martinez, president of the Martinez Community Foundation." I approached the podium with the confidence my father had taught me to project, looking out at an audience that included judges, city council members, business executives, and community leaders. 6 months ago, these people had never heard of Sophia Martinez. Tonight, they were applauding my foundation's work with genuine respect. "Thank you for honoring my father's memory through your support of community development initiatives," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. Carlos Martinez believed that success meant nothing unless it improved other people's lives. I spoke for 15 minutes about the scholarship programs, business development loans, and legal assistance projects my father had quietly funded for over 2 decades. The audience listened with the kind of attention reserved for speakers who commanded genuine authority. "This year," I continued, "we're expanding our programs to include vocational training for young adults, small business mentorship, and emergency assistance for families facing medical financial crises. These initiatives honor my father's belief that community investment creates lasting prosperity for everyone. As I concluded my remarks, the applause was enthusiastic and sustained. But what mattered most was the expression on my family's faces as they watched respected community leaders treat me as an equal, someone whose opinions and commitments carried real weight in shaping the city's future. After the ceremony, the networking reception opened opportunities for conversations that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. "Miss Martinez," said Councilman David Rodriguez, approaching me, "I'd like to discuss the waterfront redevelopment project. Your father's input was invaluable during the planning stages, and we'd welcome your participation in the next phase." "I'd be honored to continue my father's involvement," I replied, understanding this was far more than a polite invitation. The city government was formally acknowledging my father's role in major development decisions and offering me a seat at the table where those decisions were made. Vincent appeared at my elbow with perfect timing. "Sophia, there are some people from the Port Authority who'd like to meet you." As I moved through the reception, being introduced to officials and business leaders, I caught glimpses of my family watching with expressions ranging from amazement to pride. They were finally seeing their once despised family member being treated as a significant figure in the community their father had always claimed didn't respect us. The most satisfying moment came when Richard Atlantic, the construction company executive who tried to intimidate me months earlier, approached with obvious nervousness. "Miss Martinez," he said respectfully, "I wanted to express my appreciation for the professional way you handled our territorial disagreement last year. Atlantic Construction would welcome opportunities to bid on foundation projects." "I'll consider it," I replied coolly, enjoying his discomfort as he realized he was now asking for work from someone he'd previously tried to bully. The evening concluded with my family gathering around me as we prepared to leave. Their pride in my accomplishments genuine and unmistakable. "Sophia," Grandmother Maria said, taking my arm as we walked to the cars, "your father would be so proud of what you've built on his foundation." "I'm just continuing his work." "No," she corrected firmly, "you're expanding it, making it bigger and better than he ever imagined possible." As we drove home through the city where my father had built his empire and where I was now building mine, I reflected on the complete transformation of the past year. The family who had humiliated me at my father's funeral now bragged to their friends about my community leadership and business success. The relatives who called my bloodline pathetic now worked for me and depended on my goodwill. The people who had dismissed my father as a criminal now acknowledged him as a visionary who had improved thousands of lives. But more than revenge or family reconciliation, I discovered the true power of my inheritance, the ability to make positive changes in people's lives, to solve problems traditional institutions couldn't address, to honor my father's memory through actions rather than words. The scared, ashamed girl who had stood by her father's grave 9 months ago had evolved into someone who commanded respect through competence, generosity, and the careful application of inherited influence. I was finally worthy of being Carlos Martinez's daughter. 1 year after my father's funeral, I stood in the same cemetery where my family had humiliated me. But this time, I wasn't alone. A bronze plaque had been installed beside his headstone, commemorating his community contributions and bearing the seal of the Martinez Community Foundation. Vincent stood respectfully beside me as I placed fresh flowers on the grave. "He would be proud of what you've accomplished," he said quietly. "I hope so," I replied, thinking about the empire I'd not just inherited, but expanded. I've tried to honor everything he taught me. You've done more than honor it, Vincent observed. You've improved it. The community programs, the legitimate business expansion, the family reconciliation. Your father always hoped you'd build something better than what he left you. Behind us, my family waited at a respectful distance. Uncle Richard and Aunt Patricia, who now managed the foundation's financial operations with dedication that had surprised everyone. Jake, who'd been promoted to regional manager after proving his competence and commitment, and Emma, who was opening our third community center next month. But the most significant change was Grandmother Maria, who had become my closest advisor and fiercest supporter. At 86, she'd found new purpose, helping to coordinate the foundation's senior services programs. Your father spent 20 years building power in the shadows, she told me recently. You've spent 1 year bringing that power into the light and using it for good. That's evolution, not just inheritance. The morning ceremony was small and private, but the afternoon event would be very different. We were hosting the annual Martinez Foundation Community Day, expecting over 500 attendees for food, entertainment, and the announcement of our largest scholarship program expansion yet. As we prepared to leave the cemetery, my phone buzzed with a text message that made me smile. Marcus Thompson, the construction company owner whose business I'd saved during my first week learning my father's operations, was reporting that his company had just won the contract for our new vocational training center. Full circle, I murmured, showing Vincent the message. Your father always said the best business relationships were the ones where everyone succeeded, Vincent replied. You've taken that principle and applied it to the entire community. The Community Day event was held in Riverside Park, the same location where my father had quietly funded playground improvements and safety upgrades for over a decade. Now it hosted an annual celebration where scholarship recipients met their donors, small business owners connected with mentors, and families accessed resources that could change their lives. I moved through the crowd, greeting people whose lives had been touched by my father's legacy and by my expansion of his work. College students who had received Martinez scholarships, small business owners who had launched their ventures through our loan programs, and families who had received help during medical emergencies were all present. Miss Martinez approached a young woman I recognized from this year's scholarship ceremony. I wanted you to know that I'm planning to study business administration so I can come back and work for the foundation someday, she said. These were the moments that mattered most, not the power or respect I had aimed, but the proof that my father's vision of success, helping others achieve their own, was creating lasting change in people's lives. The highlight of the afternoon was the announcement of our new partnership with the city's community college system, offering full tuition coverage for any graduate of our vocational training programs who wish to continue their education. This expansion represents a 300% increase in our educational support programs, I announced to the assembled crowd. It's what my father would have wanted, creating pathways to success for anyone willing to work for it. As the celebration continued into the evening, I found myself thinking about the girl who had stood humiliated and alone at her father's funeral 12 months ago. She had known nothing about business, politics, or the complex world her father had navigated for 20 years. That girl had been defined by other people's opinions, limited by their expectations, and diminished by their cruelty. The woman I had become was defined by results, limited only by imagination, and strengthened by every challenge overcome. My phone rang as the event wound down. The caller ID displayed a number I didn't recognize, but Vincent nodded when I showed him the screen. Miss Martinez, this is Detective James Morrison with Metro Police. I'm calling because we have a situation that requires someone with your particular expertise and community connections. What kind of situation? I asked, though I already sensed what this call represented. Drug dealers targeting the elementary school near the waterfront. Traditional law enforcement approaches haven't been effective, and community leaders suggested we reach out to you for advice on alternative solutions. This was the moment my education had been preparing me for, a problem requiring my father's kind of creative problem solving, but applied with the community support and legitimacy I had built over the past year. "I'll make some calls," I told Detective Morrison. "Give me 48 hours to explore options." As I hung up, Vincent was already reaching for his phone. "I'll arrange meetings with the appropriate people," he said. "Time to see how well you've learned your father's lessons about community protection." Standing in the park where hundreds of families enjoyed an evening of free food, entertainment, and services funded by my father's legacy, I realized this call represented more than just another problem to solve. It marked the completion of my transformation, from victim to protector, from outcast to community leader, from Carlos Martinez's ashamed daughter to his worthy successor. My family approached as the park began to empty, their faces glowing with pride at the success of the evening's celebration. "Sophia," Jake said, "I want you to know how grateful I am for everything you've done for all of us this year. Not just the jobs and financial help, but the chance to be better people, to be part of something meaningful." "I never understood what Uncle Carlos was building until I saw what you're building on top of it," Emma added. "We owe you more than we can ever repay," Aunt Patricia said, her voice thick with emotion. "For forgiving us, for including us, for showing us who we could be instead of punishing us for who we were." "Family helps family," I replied, using the words they once spoke so easily but never truly understood. That's what my father taught me, even when his own family didn't reciprocate. As we drove home through the city where my father had spent 20 years building influence and I had spent 1 year legitimizing it, I thought about the upcoming conversation with Detective Morrison. My father had solved problems through careful analysis, strategic relationships, and the judicious application of pressure when necessary. I would solve this new problem using the same methods, but with advantages he never had: community support, government cooperation, and the ability to work openly rather than in the shadows. The scared, ashamed girl who had been humiliated at her father's funeral 12 months ago had become the woman who commanded respect at City Hall, who could mobilize resources to protect children, who could build lasting change instead of managing temporary solutions. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more real-life stories about transformation, family dynamics, and the power of perseverance. Drop a comment about your own experience with family members who underestimated you. I was finally and proudly Carlos Martinez's daughter.